just came off track. Chris is popping off that front sway end link. I'm gonna pull the wheels off and we're gonna get this sway bar on. Around these ridiculously hot brakes, we're just gonna buzz off that 17mm that holds that stud in using an impact. Okay, sway end link disconnected. Time to get that bushing and take off this inner cover. There's one 10mm screw that holds this panel on, and then you can see it mouses through the air conditioning return hose, which can be a little bit problematic. But make sure it goes back through that hose. This is the best reason to have a lift. Can't get the car high enough to get this bar out, but you can kind of swing it towards the back and get it to pass through. Guys, I'm back. We were gonna do the sway bar install at the track, but then when it came down to it, we were actually missing some of the brackets and bushings for that front sway bar. So we're back at the shop. We're gonna continue the installation, kind of pick up where we left off. Actually, right now, the car, we just drove back from the track without those front sway bar end links in it, so the shock mount brackets are actually sitting loose in there. So anyway, we're gonna get it back together. So a quick safety, jack in at the front cross member, and we're gonna put it on jack stands on the two frame rails. Pop off tires. Okay, so here's all the components of the kit. The new Hotchkis bars come with these replacement brackets and some hardware. These are going to be M10 hardware. The factory mount up front, you can see, is actually M8, and they're replaced with these Hotchkis. They're more generic sway bar bushing brackets, and then they've got some lubrication features for a zert fitting. Goes up into those channels. You can kind of see some cavities there to hold the grease. And then the rear, they're adapting to, you know, similar kind of stamped bracket, and then similar lubrication channels there with some polyurethane. And we'll probably, you know, eventually change these to the Super Pro 19mm rear brackets and bushings just for the factory, because they actually go down into the subframe and they don't make it stand off a little bit. But these aren't so bad. You know, Hotchkis sells these as a replacement refresh kit, so at least they're available in the aftermarket down the road. Just one thing to note with these brackets, we also, this is our 2nd gen relocation bracket, and we can make this in an M10 or an M8. Right now this is an M8 to emulate more of a factory mount. But we're going to be mounting with these just to show you the, I guess, the various locations and flexibility you've got with the relocation bracket. These brackets from Hotchkis, you actually need a nut and bolt. So these are just loose nuts in the back. And with ours, it's a dog bone that's, you know, it sits flush, but it's got nutserts in it, so you don't need to hold the back side of it. This is our adjustable front sway end link. Actually, we're back order on these, so I had to build these from some semi-used parts, at least on this fitting. And so this is the bolt that's going to go through the factory shock mount bracket. It's going to go into this. And a lot of people have asked, well, how do I set these things? Well, initially we're going to mount this sway bar up, and we're going to see where the bar is neutral, meaning flat with its bushings and its mount. And then we're going to measure the distance center to center, and then we're going to adjust this end link so that it's neutral and doesn't add any preload or pre-inclination to the front sway bar. That means we're going to get the most travel out of that sway bar and the most usable spring rate out of it. So that's going to go in that mount right there in the front of the shock. Kind of hard to see, but I'll assemble it and show you a little. So we've got that bolt poking through. It's going to be a 19mm. Get it coming through all the way. One thing to note is to put the washer on the back side. It just doesn't want to come through here. That's where we'll use our persuasive brass. Carefully so that we don't damage any threads. Washers on the back side. So I can move that camera. It's a little bit easier to see. Torque on this is going to be 55 foot-pounds. And there you go. So this nut we're never going to touch because we pre-assemble that here. And again, we're going to line this up. We're going to take a center line measurement from this to the eye of the sway bar. And then that's what we're going to set our end link to. This is our bracket that we're going to be replacing right here. And it's 3 bolts. I'm not going to go into how to take those out, but you just remove them. And I'll show you how to put the new ones on. So factory bracket's out. Again, it's just the 2 screws on top, 1 screw on the bottom, 12mm socket. There's one thing to note, that there's an airbag sensor up there. And where is it? Right there. Probably want to watch that guy. Just make sure you don't bump it or jostle the connection. And we're going to mount the new one. And of course, a little bit of the old Tin Man coat here. Keep those threads good. Okay, there's the new bracket in place, and yeah. I just looked at that anti-seize and it got on that bracket. But we're going to be mounting the sway bar. We're going to do the other side and kind of go through the adjustment range and why you would want to have this level of adjustment on your sway bar. One of the most challenging things, I think, when you're trying to work on a car on the ground, especially this installation, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to do it on the floor, is getting the angle of the sway bar to come up through this air conditioning line, because it has to go through that line. So here we've got the bar. It's going to orient like that. You can kind of see that a little bit. So this adds the clearance to go underneath front crank pulley up there. So we can play a few little tricks to get it through there. That's how it's going to end up looking. Now we'll put the brackets on. So again, that bushing has these features in it, and we're gonna use the included grease. We don't want to do too much, but we just want to put it right down the middle, because it's going to actually displace in all those little grooves. Hopefully it's going to last long enough. Between greasings. There. Start with this side. Let's see how I want to show you guys what we're doing here. Guess that'll work if I don't tip the phone. And the M8 screws that we use an M13 head on them, which is actually more typical than a 12. Around this guard. You can probably actually see what I'm doing wrong better than I can. It's hard to line those babies up. Okay, that feels better. Just get those finger tight. Add some anti-seize on it later. Okay, now that we've got those exposed, we're going to throw some anti-seize on. A little bit of anti-seize on there now. Now we're going to snug them up, but not necessarily all the way, because still got to show you all the adjustment that's possible with these. So we're just going to snug enough so that we can do that preload measurement. One thing over here. So one thing you see right off the bat is that this bushing terminates right at the end of that bend. So that's going to put a little bit of stress on the bushing all the time, but it's also going to keep the bar centered. And probably tighten that one a little bit too much because we aren't able to slide our adjustment. Now we can actually go back over to our endlink situation, and you're going to be able to see how ideally, oh man, I don't want to rotate. Okay, it's hung up over here. Okay, perfect. Found one of our Night Eyes cable ties here. Soft wire centered cable tie. So again, you can see that we're trying to make this point level back with the bushing. So you're going to have to eyeball this, but that's the distance we want to measure now between those two mounts. One more thing real quick about clearance and kind of this area. It's tight in here, so we always suggest to take this bolt, flip it around, because that is a lot more protrusion than that, right? So if you put the head on the front going towards the back, going to free up more clearance for that end link to travel. And then just for the sake of being in this area and you know, not wanting to put the car back down, we're just going to preload by putting some load on with blocks of wood. It's not going to represent the true weight of the car because we can't jack on the outer hub. A different way to do it would be to add some ramps, and so putting the car down on ramps and that measuring and reconnecting the sway end link that way. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. Again, the front isn't as susceptible because it's got a really long pivot relative to where the sway bar connects. And then going back to the sway end link, or rather the adjustable bushing mount. So this presentation right here and how the sway end link is going to come up, and I took that off, but just put this here. So depending on how this linkage is going to present itself, we want this linkage to be perfectly vertical, not in a Z, not stretched out like this. So having that adjustment is going to help us get this linkage as vertical as we can. That means we have to use less misalignment on the joint, and it's going to last a lot longer. The nice thing about the Hotchkis bar is that it does a great job of putting this presentation of the sway end link right where it needs to be. But for other guys that have adjustable arms, for things like our Pro Angle kit, where we're moving things forward quite a bit, we really want those adjustable brackets just so we can fine-tune where that linkage goes. And then just a comment about which one is stiffer. The one that's closer to the pivot point is going to be stiffer because it's got less mechanical advantage. The one further out is going to be the softer setting. So we're going to favor stiff just because this is going to be a track car. So we're trying to get as much resistance to those sticky tires and G-forces as possible. So yet another way to measure that sway end link distance would be to use one of these track stands. So this is a product that we made last year. We're doing a few little enhancements to it before we release it to the world. One of them is kind of adding a little bit of ability to do extreme negative camber for when the car isn't in an ideal camber range. That base plate needs to pivot. So look for these coming pretty soon. Again, they do a great job for doing track alignments with some slip plates on the bottom, and really allow you to work on your car while it's loaded without having a tire in place. Alright, now that we got our suspension jacked up on some super sketchy wood blocks, We're gonna go ahead and take that measurement again. Yeah, we're actually more like 3.3, 3 and a quarter. 3 and a quarter. And our car isn't lowered too much. It's probably lowered, I don't know, maybe an inch. So you can take that for every inch of lowering. This is going to change about 3/4 of an inch. So 3 and a quarter right now is what we're going to do. Okay, so adjusted it, and again, this one is right about 3 inches. We'd expect it. We're actually going to lower a little bit more once we get wheel weight on it. So we've adjusted our end link. We've tightened everything up in terms of this stud. It's got 2 flats back here, and we're going to hold that, compress it until you engage the nylock and compress these nylon washers. We want that to be kind of a compliant mount. It's got those washers and nylon spacers just so we're not deforming the nylon necessarily, but so we're actually making it a compliant mount just in case this thing goes over misalignment or something. That can put a lot of stress on that stud, so it gives it a little bit of a damper, if you will. We're going to set these jam nuts, and you just do that by holding this flat and tightening this nut into that mechanism. And now's a great time to show you the adjustment. So right here, it's perfect. That linkage is vertical. We're going to check this again once it's compressed, but this is really what we want out of this linkage because it's going to maximize the misalignment on that linkage as it travels up and down. But if this was another sway bar aside from the Hotchkis, that might be closer to the lower control arm, in which case you would want to move the sway bar forward. So those mounts are loose, so you can see we can move it forward or we can move it back. So really we've got a lot of adjustment to kind of fine tune where that location is. So if we did put this, we are going to have a little bit of arc. So I'm trying to get it back to where it was. Yeah, I guess something like that. So if we do have a little bit of arc and pivot when we put load on the suspension, then we can make adjustments to that bar, while it's in place. But yeah, that kind of concludes the installation of this bar. Of course, when everything is in place like this, you're going to go ahead and tighten everything up. You can see, again, that shock bolt, see how close everything is. So that's really why we want to turn that bolt around and have it be in a different orientation. The standard maintenance for these, they don't have any boots, but we do ask that after it's in this kind of state, you can coat it with some DuPont Teflon spray. It's a dry lube. It's going to put a thin layer of Teflon coating on there. It's going to keep things from sticking, accumulating. We are using these nicer FK 3-piece rod ends, so they do tend to wipe away any debris and contamination, but it will just prevent things from sticking in the area. So when things aren't there, they aren't going to stick to things. Yeah, one more shot of that. So yeah, we're going to tighten everything up, get this thing on the road, and we'll have some driving impressions after this. But hopefully we can get back to the track, do some secondary lap times, and just kind of show you how much of an improvement this lateral spring rate is going to add. And again, a sway bar is kind of a substitute for running extremely aggressive spring rates. Right now we're just running some old coilovers that are pretty undersprung, so we're expecting big improvements from this bar. As the static spring rate goes up, of course, the bar diameter would need to be significantly larger to make a significant impact over what the static spring rate is. But for street driving, it's a really good bang for buck. You're adding a lot of spring rate, but you're not really deteriorating your regular ride quality or your suspension travel. Thanks, and stay tuned. One last thing I wanted to bring up. So again, we're talking about having an adjustable mount. So this is where we ended up to have it be pretty neutral. And you can see we're pretty much in the center of that mount. So if we look back at the Hotchkis bracket that's included, it's a center mounted bracket. So really, if you've got a Hotchkis bar and you're not doing anything funky with your suspension, these brackets are going to be great. They're going to work out great for you. Larger, oversized hardware, and everything should be pretty much good to go. Okay, so now here's the real test. I'm going to see how it handles. Granted, I don't have a video before, but I can at least give you my impressions of this particular setup. And you can also hear the HPS intake and our BP equal length header and 3-inch exhaust. So right off the bat, steering input is drastically improved, and if you remember, we've got a aggressive steering knuckle on here. We've got our RCA Hysteer. Still soft on the front shocks. That hasn't changed, but initial turn-in is definitely flatter. We're able to get this thing rocking pretty good on initiation, and that really that made it interesting at the track. So this should be a big improvement once we get back out there. Wait for traffic to clear a little bit. So our little test sweeper. Things are quite a bit better. Of how flat the car responds. Now we're still going to get some of those bumps when we hit bumps when we're actually loaded over, and that's a lot to do with the valving that's on here, some worn out old TNCS shocks, and we increased the spring rates on them a little bit as well. So you know, not the best display of overall suspension handling, but you know, not really too bad. It's really a pretty good improvement for something that doesn't take too long to install, to really get a vast improvement out of your steering input and overall cornering capability. Rubbing